The 28th of March, 1942. The mouth of the Loire estuary on the Atlantic coast of occupied France. A British destroyer built during the First World War, so old the Royal Navy had already tried to give her away once, is running at full speed toward the gates of the largest dry dock in Western Europe, flying a German naval ensign and answering enemy searchlights in the enemy's own signal code. She is packed with 4.5 tons of explosives hidden inside a hollow steel and concrete tank welded into a bow on a time fuse nobody on the German side can see. In a few minutes, she will ram herself directly into the lock gates at 19 knots. In about 8 hours, long after her surviving crew have scattered into the town or been taken prisoner, she will detonate, and the only dock on the entire Atlantic coast capable of servicing Germany's newest and most feared battleship will be destroyed for the rest of the war. This is the story of HMS Campbeltown and the St Nazaire Raid, remembered inside the Royal Navy simply as the greatest raid of all. By early 1942, Britain had a very specific, very narrow problem, and it had a name: Tirpitz. Germany's newest battleship, sister to the Bismarck, sunk the previous year, was based in Norwegian waters, and the Admiralty's greatest fear was that she would break out into the Atlantic to savage convoy traffic the way her sister had briefly done. If Tirpitz was damaged in such an operation, or simply needed routine maintenance, there was only one dry dock on the whole Atlantic coast large enough to take her: the Normandy dock at St Nazaire, built in 1932 to service the ocean liner SS Normandy, at the time the largest passenger ship in the world. Take away that dock, and any German capital ship venturing into the Atlantic would have no safe harbor to return to for repairs. It would have to run the gauntlet of the English Channel or the heavily patrolled gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK to get home. Destroying a single set of lock gates, roughly 51 meters of steel and concrete, could functionally cage the most dangerous ship in the German Navy without firing a shot at her directly. The trouble was reaching it. St Nazaire sat several miles up a heavily defended estuary, protected by coastal artillery, flak batteries, minefields, patrol boats, and a garrison in the thousands. Conventional naval bombardment was impossible without exposing capital ships to shore batteries and U-boats in a channel too shallow and constricted for them to maneuver. Aerial bombing risked killing French civilians and still might not destroy a structure that solid. When the plan for a direct raid using an explosive-laden ship was first proposed, the Admiralty's own initial reaction was skepticism bordering on dismissal. The kind of plan one internal account later described as full of what the planners themselves called imponderables, hazardous in the extreme. Mountbatten's combined operations staff reworked it and pushed it through anyway. It was approved on the 3rd of March 1942 under the name Operation Chariot, and the ship chosen to carry it out was, by any conventional standard, a poor choice for a mission requiring speed, stealth, and precision timing under fire. HMS Campbeltown had begun life as the USS Buchanan, a First World War-era four-stack destroyer laid down in 1918, one of 50 aging American destroyers handed over to Britain in 1940 under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, ships so outdated the US Navy was glad to be rid of them. By 1942 she was, in the plain language of the official histories, an obsolete destroyer, too old and too slow for frontline convoy escort work, exactly the kind of vessel nobody would think twice about sacrificing, and exactly the kind of vessel nobody expected to end the career of Hitler's newest battleship. What made her useful was not what she could do in a conventional fight, it was what could be done to her in a shipyard beforehand, and what her crew was prepared to do with her once the fighting started. Naval engineers stripped Campbeltown down and rebuilt her disguise from the hull up. 2 of her 4 funnels were removed entirely, and the remaining 2 cut at an angle, reshaping her silhouette to resemble a German Moe-class torpedo boat closely enough to survive a distant glance in the dark. Extra armor plating was welded around her bridge and wheelhouse to protect the crew who would have to hold course under fire in the final approach. Most importantly, in a specially built compartment behind her forward gun position, engineers installed a steel tank encased in concrete and packed it with roughly 4.5 tons of amytal explosive, wired to pencil-type delay fuses, timed to detonate hours after the ship had already been rammed home and abandoned. The entire plan depended on a piece of theater. Sail an obviously old, obviously British-shaped destroyer straight up a heavily defended river looking, for just long enough, like a German patrol returning to harbor, by a few extra minutes of confusion with the German ensign and the right signal lamp code, and used those minutes to close the last mile at full speed before anyone worked out what she actually was. At around 10 in the evening on the 28th of March, the raiding force, roughly 611 men of the Royal Navy, and the commandos aboard Campbeltown, and a flotilla of 18 small motor launches, sighted the marker beacon laid by the submarine HMS Sturgeon at the mouth of the estuary and turned in toward St Nazaire. An RAF diversionary bombing raid meant to draw German attention away from the river was aborted mid-mission because of low cloud cover, which meant the aircraft never dropped enough bombs to convincingly look like an ordinary raid, and instead left German gunners on full alert listening to aircraft engines overhead with nothing to bomb. As the flotilla crept up the final stretch of river, German searchlights caught Campbeltown and signal lamps challenged her. Her signalman answered in the correct German code long enough to buy several critical extra minutes before the deception collapsed, and every gun position in range opened fire simultaneously. If you've been enjoying these deep dives into the Royal Navy's most audacious operations, subscribing helps the channel keep making them. What followed in the last stretch of river was close to point-blank slaughter. German shore batteries and flak positions raked Campbeltown from both banks at ranges measured in a few hundred yards. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, lost 2 helmsmen killed at the wheel in the space of a few minutes, and the enhanced bridge armor was the only reason he and his surviving officers were still standing to keep her on course. At 1:34 on the 29th of March, running at roughly 19 knots, Campbeltown struck the caisson of the Normandy dock almost exactly on her planned mark and wedged herself onto the gate structure. Beatty and Lieutenant Nigel Tibbets took the additional step of scuttling and further disabling the ship on the spot to make sure the Germans could not simply tow her off the gates before the hidden charge went off. Commando demolition teams then swarmed off her deck and across the dock structure under continuing fire, fanning out to destroy pumping machinery, winding gear, and lock equipment that would have taken years to rebuild, even if the caisson itself somehow survived. Every one of the primary demolition objectives was successfully destroyed within the first half hour of the ship grounding, largely before German reinforcements arrived in strength. The evacuation is the part of the story the raid's planners had gotten badly wrong. The wooden motor launches meant to ferry the commandos back out to sea, built from mahogany and carrying exposed fuel tanks, proved catastrophically vulnerable to the same shore batteries that had already chewed up Campbeltown, and most were sunk, set ablaze, or disabled before they ever reached the men waiting on the dockside. With their sea route cut off, the commando teams had no choice but to fight through the town of St Nazaire itself on foot, trying to break out overland toward unoccupied territory, or simply keep fighting until their ammunition ran out. Of the roughly 611 to 622 men who took part in the raid, only 228 made it back to Britain. A further 5 reached safety later, overland through Spain and Gibraltar. 169 were killed. 215 were taken prisoner. It was, in raw human terms, a very costly night for a force that had gone in already accepting the mission was likely to be one way for many of them. What the Germans did not know, as they began clearing wreckage and posting guards around the grounded hulk the next morning, was that Campbeltown's actual weapon had not yet gone off. At 10:35 that morning, with German officers and curious sightseers reportedly gathered on and around the wreck to inspect it, the hidden charge detonated. The explosion killed more than 360 German personnel in a single instant and obliterated the caisson gates the ship had been rammed against, flooding the dry dock and wrecking it structurally beyond any quick repair. 2 days later, on the 1st of April, a secondary set of delayed action torpedoes fired earlier by the small craft MTB-74 into the dock's outer gates detonated as well, adding a second wave of destruction and, according to several accounts, enough confusion that jumpy German sentries began firing at their own men in the dark. Between the 2 explosions, the Normandy dock was left completely unusable. Some sources record it stayed out of commission until 1947. Others cite 1,948, and either way, for every remaining month of the Second World War, the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast capable of taking a ship the size of Tirpitz simply did not function. The strategic consequence was exactly what the raid's planners had gambled on. Tirpitz never seriously attempted an Atlantic breakout for the remainder of the war. Deprived of anywhere to go if she was damaged that far from home, she spent most of her remaining career sheltering in Norwegian fjords. watched constantly by British reconnaissance, and eventually sunk at anchor there in November 1944 by RAF Lancasters carrying tallboy bombs, never having fired a shot at an Atlantic convoy. A raid that cost the Royal Navy and the commandos more than two-thirds of the men who took part had, in exchange, permanently removed the one geographic advantage that made a German battleship's Atlantic sortie survivable. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the action, to Beatty, to Lieutenant Colonel Newman, to Commander Ryder, and posthumously to Able Seaman Savage and Sergeant Durant, alongside 89 other decorations for gallantry. The raid's success, together with a separate commando raid on the Channel Island of Sark around the same period, provoked something else entirely from Hitler: the notorious Commando Order, decreeing that any captured Allied Special Forces personnel be executed rather than treated as prisoners of war, a measure of just how seriously the German High Command had come to fear exactly this kind of operation. Nothing about HMS Campbeltown's specifications suggested she belonged in this story. She was a hand-me-down destroyer from the previous war, too slow and too old for the fight the Royal Navy was actually fighting in 1942, the kind of ship whose only remaining value on paper was as scrap or as bait. What made her decisive was not her guns, her armor, or her speed. It was the decision to treat her obsolescence as an asset rather than a liability, disguise her just enough to buy a few final minutes of confusion, load her with more explosive force than her original designers ever imagined she would carry, and trust several hundred men to finish the job under fire even after the ship herself had done her part. The Normandy dock was built to service the largest ocean liner on Earth. It took one worn-out destroyer, sacrificed on purpose, to make sure it never serviced anything German again.